Thank you, all of you, for joining. Welcome to the Trustees Conservation in Action webinar series. I'm Cynthia Dittbrenner. I'm the VP of Natural Resources here at the Trustees. I want to thank you all for joining and hope you're excited to get an in-depth look at our marshes, the vulnerabilities they face, and what we are doing at the Trustees to restore them and to increase their resiliency in the face of sea level rise. At each one of our 120 plus, the number keeps growing, properties, they have their own unique history, natural resources, and different treasures for people to explore. And our team of stewards, curators, ecologists, just numerous staff at the Trustees care for each one of these places and help engage the public in those treasures that we have there. These webinars specifically are designed to help engage you in some of that work that we're doing on the ground, and also to inspire you to go visit some of these properties you may not have seen yet. I want to give a huge thank you to our donors out there who have helped support our mission and members. The work and projects that are being presented today would not be possible without your support. Today, you'll hear from two exceptional professionals on my team, Russ Hopping, who's our lead coastal ecologist, and Alejandra Narvaez, who's our coastal project manager. Russ has more than 30 years experience here at the Trustees, managing and restoring both coastal and inland ecosystems, and has a master's in environmental biology. He was one of the people that launched these efforts to restore the Great Marsh over 6 years ago, so can talk a lot about the history there. And then Alejandra has been with us for just over a year as our coastal project manager. She manages all of our restoration projects along the coast and came from the Mystic River Watershed Association and has a master's in agricultural ecology. So before we get started, I just want to give you some logistics. There is a Q&A button at the very bottom. So as you have questions, please type them in there, and we will stop at the end of the presentations and do questions all at once. There's also right next to the Q&A button, a CC button. If you would like to enable the closed captions to see the transcript as we go, just click right on that, not the arrow, just click right on it. All right, so at this point, I will pass it over to Russ Hopping.
Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here. So Alejandra and I are going to be talking about some of our projects. I will mostly be focused on the Great Marsh and our salt marsh restoration, and then Alejandra is going to talk about some exciting newer projects on other parts of the state. So for some of you, this may be more of a recap, and others, this may be new. So just to start us out, looking at the picture you see in front of you right here, this is a typical salt marsh. This is a ditch. So nature does not create a straight line like this. This is a ditch that's been there for a very long time. And when the tides come in and out, as you see in this picture, they typically do not flow out, up and out of the ditch. But then you get every so many days a month, the tide does come up out of that ditch and flood the marsh, particularly with storms or some of those higher tides that we get, particularly king tides in the fall. So the grass you see that's in the ditch or on the sides of it, it looks coarser and taller. That is the low marsh grass. That is Spartina alterniflora. And then not too far away from that ditch, you'll see a much softer looking, shorter grass. Those are our high marsh grasses, mostly made up of Spartina patens. So as I go through this presentation, you may hear me say high marsh or low marsh. If you can keep this image in mind, that might be helpful. So those low marsh grasses get flooded typically daily, sometimes twice a day, and then the high marsh gets flooded only a couple of times during a month. Next slide. So just to orient us, the Trustees has approximately 30 reservations that we would call coastal, starting up in the Great Marsh, which is at the the top of the map, where you'll see a cluster of properties, and then all the way down to Buzzards Bay, the Cape, and the islands, where we have some other properties scattered about. Next slide. So just to set the stage here, why we're kind of here today and talking about this, what's We all have heard about climate change, and one of the impacts of that is rising sea level. So what does that really mean? So, in other words, we're phrased here, what are we facing? And this is some of the projections. Just want to start here to kind of give a sense of there is a range. So you'll see from intermediate to extreme. The trend, even before today, so to speak, you can see the trend has been going up slightly, but then from now going forward, that increase gets much greater. So those lines really get steeper. Even if we look at something on the intermediate to intermediate high, you can see we're talking 4 or 5 feet by the end of the century in terms of sea level rise. That's pretty significant. So again, this is a model, but this is, where some of the data and the trend is telling us this could be our future. Next slide. In 2017, we contracted with Woods Hole Group to do a coastal vulnerability assessment. It did look at access, cultural resources, and our natural resources, and I'll be talking mostly about the natural resources today, or we will. And it did identify, I guess no surprise, our coastal beaches and salt marshes are the most vulnerable habitats or community types, landscapes, so to speak, along the coast. There is a relationship here between the two. Most of the state's 45,000 acres of salt marsh do occur behind coastal beaches or barrier islands. But today, we're really not going to focus on the beaches. Alejandra will touch on them a little bit, but for the Great Marsh discussion, just keep in mind that there is this other important component of the barrier islands that's part of the equation. Next slide. So why are salt marshes important? Hopefully these are not new. These are just some of them. There are many reasons, and we typically call these environmental services. Clearly, coastal communities are very interested in storm surge and the flooding that's occurring along our coastal communities with infrastructure, private property. I'm going to touch a little bit on the habitat for wildlife. One big one that has shown up recently is carbon sequestration. Just want to point out that some of the latest research is indicating that salt marshes do sequester or can sequester considerably more carbon per acre than a similar area of forest. And one of the reasons for that is the peat, right? So what is salt marsh peat? And peat is mostly made up of undecomposed plant material. Up to 80% of that peat is undecomposed plant material. That equals carbon. So just keep that in mind if you can as I go through. Next slide. This is just another graphic indicating that sea level rise. If you see that blue line intersecting with the dark green line, that dark green line is essentially where high marsh habitat is, and the blue line is mean sea level. So again, based on the models and the projections, out around 2070, we're going to see some major change in the salt marsh. I'm going to graphically show that a little different, but it's essentially we're looking at high marsh converting over to low marsh. Next slide. So it is a significant resource statewide. I mentioned this 45,000 acres in Massachusetts. One of the indicators that we're thinking about is this little guy right here. This is a salt marsh sparrow, and it's probably the best named bird I can think of. It is totally dependent upon salt marsh. It breeds in salt marsh. It winters in salt marsh. It is restricted to the eastern coast of North America, all of it within the United States, actually. So it breeds from southern Maine and winters down to Florida. Again, all in salt marsh. So I frequently call this little guy the piping plover of the salt marsh. So just like piping plovers that they require, sandy beaches, both for breeding and wintering. This sparrow requires salt marsh for all of its needs. Fortunately, it's declining by about 9% annually. One of the reasons for that is sea level rise. And this is an interesting picture. So I'll just say Massachusetts supports about 10% of the global population of the salt marsh sparrow, and the great marsh 5%. So 50% of salt marsh sparrow in Massachusetts, but 5% of the global population. So really important for this species. This is an interesting slide in that you could look at it and say, well, this is horrible, or you could look at it and say, well, that's kind of a cool adaptation. These guys are uniquely adapted to salt marshes. So as long as the tides or we don't have storms when the tides are high, these birds can survive. So the eggs, as long as they don't wash out of the nest cup, they can fully float within that nest cup with the tide. And when the tide goes out, the parents return, incubate, they're fine. Same thing with the chicks. As long as they don't get washed out of the nest cup, tide goes down, they're fine. But what's happening, because we're getting more dramatic sea level rise in storms, what's happening is the eggs and the chicks are getting washed out of their nest cups. So that's where we're seeing one of the major drivers for why this species is declining, but why it's also a good indicator for marsh health. Next slide. So, pardon me. So I'm going to be talking about the top area of this graphic, that larger red circle around the Great Marsh, and then Alejandra is going to talk about some of our very exciting projects elsewhere in the state. Next slide. So this is the Great Marsh, at least the ACEC, the Area of Critical Environmental Concern. It does extend a little bit in both directions, but for all practical purposes, you're looking at the Great Marsh ecosystem that does include those barrier islands I mentioned, Crane, Plum Island, for example. But this really illustrates the concentration of properties the trustees has in the Great Marsh, including the uplands. We have 15% of the Great Marsh ecosystem. Next slide. So graphically, this is another way to show kind of what the modeling is telling us is likely to happen with salt marsh. So this is essentially representing current conditions, where you see that light green is the high marsh, the dark green, which you see closer to Choate Island. Yep, thank you. That's low marsh, and then the blue is open water, and that light colored tan, that's exposed mud or sand flats. So keep those colors in mind. Next slide. So here you go. By 2070, you can hardly find any of that light green. So here's that graph I showed, where by 2070, you're seeing most of the high marsh convert to low marsh. Virtually, well, or very little, if this scenario does materialize, there's virtually no habitat here for the salt marsh sparrow to breed, for example. Next slide. And then out by 2100, you can see even the low marsh has mostly dissipated, and now we have either open water or exposed mud / sand flat. So this is the scenario we're trying to avoid with what we'll be talking about. Next slide. So in addition to sea level rise, our restoration efforts are really designed to restore hundreds of years of what you see happening in this picture. And this is where, starting in the 1600s, when Europeans settled the coastal areas, they set about modifying or altering the salt marshes to increase agricultural productivity. And essentially what they would do is build these embankments that would keep areas from receiving tidal flooding, and then they would excavate the ditches to facilitate the runoff and groundwater precipitation out of these areas through those embankments and out into the ocean. Next slide. And this is an interesting picture that is literally from the Ipswich Marshes. So this is this is the southern end of the Great Marshes, but taken in 1913, sorry, by Townsend, who used to live on Argilla Road. They don't look like that anymore, right? But there's some romance in these pictures, and some of you may be familiar with many of the artists and paintings that were done from this time, kind of looking at the marsh and kind of the romance of these idyllic pastoral landscapes. But what was done here is the salt marsh hay was harvested and stored on these what's called staddles. Those are cedar posts. and allowed to cure there. And then they're raised up so that the high tides don't wash them away or saturate them. And then at later times in the year, at the very high tides, people would come out in gondolas. These are these very broad, shallow bottom boats that would then collect this hay during the high tides and bring them back where it can be utilized. Next slide. So here's this agricultural legacy. So this is in Newbury at Old Town Hill off of Newman Road. And you can see where all these ditches are close together. Again, nature does not produce these wonderful straight lines like this. What's happening is when they are not full of water, air can get in. And because this is peat, mostly, as I mentioned, undecomposed plant material, once oxygen can get at that material, you start the decomposition process and you end up having the marsh subside in elevation, or at least the marsh cannot keep pace and build elevation with that peat to keep pace with sea level rise. Next slide. And then alternatively, what can happen, because you have all those ditches there where there used to be one or two natural creeks, when the tide comes in, the velocity of that water is slowed down and it's allowed to drop its load of sediment early on in those channels or those ditches. And then what happens is it creates a blockage or blockages that allow the groundwater to build up behind them. And what happens is the peat gets saturated and the groundwater gets expressed right at the surface. When that happens, the vegetation, these salt marsh grasses, which we're really, targeting, they essentially drown and you lose that biomass and you drop in elevation. Again, going in the wrong direction from sea level rise. You'll see I've highlighted a couple areas here in red that where the grasses have died. The open water you see there are earlier cases where the grass died and then it just converted over to water. If we don't intervene, these pools just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger and they become mega pools, which we're seeing quite a few of them out there on the marsh. Next slide. So the project goal here is to really restore the hydrology that has been altered for hundreds of years to something that would have been more natural, that reverses the marsh subsidence, both from oxidation and from oversaturation, reestablish that high marsh habitat that will particularly be important for some of these obligate species, salt marsh sparrow as an indicator, and then hopefully this will keep pace with sea level rise once we've restored this hydrology. Even if it doesn't, we have restored the hydrology so that we can then intervene with additional measures should we need to, something like thin layer deposition, something like that. Next slide. This is a typical restoration model. So this one in particular is 132 acres. That's part of our phase 2 restoration right at Crane Beach. So those of you familiar with Crane, you'll see Argilla Road there, and then as it crosses the marsh, and then the parking lot for the beach, and then the Crane Beach in the upper right. So the red lines are the embankments. The blue and the green are the ditches that were excavated. Next slide. Oh, and the green, by the way, are the ones we're going to remediate. The blue are the ones that we're going to leave there. If we need some form of ditches to remain to function as essentially facsimiles to or surrogates, if you will, for the natural creeks that would be in a marsh to allow flooding and draining. Next slide. So what is ditch remediation? So on the left, what you're seeing here is a typical ditch. Again, that first image I showed you. They're typically straight and deep. And if they're not filled with water, they're allowing groundwater to exit and drain away. And then that allows oxygen to penetrate during that to start the decomposition process. On the right is an example of after 3 years of doing ditch remediation, we now have the bottom of the ditch has become much closer to the surface, and we now see that ditch is full of marsh grasses, which are perfect and will continue that restoration process right up to the marsh surface. And discharge of groundwater is much less. Next slide. This is the process in action. You see on the left there, that's a couple of passes with a mower to harvest the grass next to the ditch that's going to get remediated. Then that hay gets moved into the ditch and secured with some twine to keep it from washing away during high tides. Next slide. And here are the tools of the trade. There is some level of automation needed here to scale up and be efficient, both at completing the task as well as cost on a per acre basis. So this level of mechanization with a mower on the left and a small hay rake on the right allows us to do that. You'll notice they're both oversized tires. You cannot really tell these machines have been out there. Next slide. And then the next technique I'm going to talk about will be runneling. And yeah, I just want to draw your attention to the orange line in the middle there. That is a runnel that is intersecting an area of light blue, which is a mega pool in formation. So that runnel will then allow some of that surface water and to drain off, providing better growing conditions for the grasses. Next slide. This is what a runnel looks like. On the left is with no runnel, groundwater has come right up to the surface and it's starting to impact the vegetation. It's dying off, becoming open water. And on the right, where a runnel has been installed, this is essentially 2 to 3 feet wide, very shallow, down to 8 to 10 inches, maybe 12 inches at the deepest. Where we have long runnels, we have to keep a slope in order to allow that water to flow out of there. But what it does is it drops down that zone of saturation 8 to 10 inches or so. That's where all the roots primarily live. And by doing that, we turn back on the growing of the vegetation and you see it has revegetated. Next slide. This is the runnel creation in process. So the excavator, this was in March, and you see the material is being piled up and staked down so it doesn't float away to create a marsh island. Next slide. And this is the first runnel we did. So this is just, that's kind of Castle Hill you see in the background there. So it was created in March of 22. You see it just starting to warm up in May. End of that growing season, you see some vegetation. But then that last slide on the right, that was taken last September at the end of the growing season. So after 3 years, I hope you can see in here that there's a lot more vegetation and much less water now that's on the marsh. So it's working beautifully. And I will say at this point, we're working at the speed of nature. So we're nudging Mother Nature and the natural processes back into this corrective action where it's going to restore itself. Next slide. And this is that nesting island that you see that was being created. This is a couple months after it was created. Next slide. It's had a chance to dry out, consolidate. So by the end of the growing season, that first growing season, fall 22, you see a lot of red there. That's Salicornia. That's an annual plant. So that was really good to see right up front. That's an indicator that the site we changed the growing conditions immediately at this site. And it was very conducive for this annual to seed in, move right in, and grow without the competition of the perennial grasses. And then same time last year, September, the end of the growing season, 3 years, that's what that island looks like. So no Salicornia, it's all been replaced by these perennial grasses that should be out there. The very top, you see, that's that high marsh grasses, that Spartina patens, that beautiful light yellow, green, and then surrounding that is the lower marsh grasses. That's the alterniflora. So beautiful success in there. So just wanted to give you a quick, yep, that's fine. Thank you. You can keep going to the next slide. So just a brief update. So Old Town Hill up in Newbury, that was phase 1. We'll be doing our 5th year of monitoring in 2025. So here's some updates from there. So right now what we're seeing, and all we did there was ditch remediation. We didn't do any runneling. So where we've been doing the ditch remediation, we are seeing the peat getting wetter. That's good. That means it's not being exposed to air, so we're not seeing the oxidation process happen. But also where we removed some clogs in those, there was 9 locations where we had to do hand removal to reopen those ditches. We've seen the zone of saturation drop down that 8 to 10 inches, and that's been perfect. So these are data loggers that are telling us both for surface water and groundwater. So we're getting to that Goldilocks zone, which is that 8 to 10 inches. Marsh elevation is responding, particularly in that area where we did the drainage enhancement by removing some of those clogs by hand. We have seen 4 to 8 millimeters of growth annually. That's important because the average sea level rise right now for the Great Marsh is about 3 to 4 millimeters a year. So we are at or above the annual pace of sea level rise with marsh elevation. That's cool. Vegetation's a little slower to respond, as you can imagine, but we are seeing slightly more high marsh grass and less of that lower marsh grass. So that's good. In the next couple of years, we expect that to really take off. And then the ditches have really shown where we've really seen great progress there. The elevation has come up to within 8 or 10 inches of the surface, and they're mostly now vegetated with grass. So that's been a significant increase. Phase 2 is a couple years behind, but I just wanted to point out there we introduced runnels. And at that point, as you can see by that image that the example that I showed, we are seeing in some cases 20% more vegetation in those areas where we runneled only after 2 years. So that's been really encouraging to see. Next slide. And I'm just about done. So this is just an overview of, together with our partners, the scale at which we're working within the Great Marsh. So overall, 16,000 acres of salt marsh, largest salt marsh ecosystem in New England. 8,000 of that is protected by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Mass Wildlife, or at least the state, the Trustees of Reservations, and then Essex County Greenbelt. And then the other 8,000 acres is privately owned or municipal owned. So all those colors represent about 8,000 acres that are in process of either being restored or have the design has been completed. Next slide. And I think it's the last. And I just want to thank all of our partners. This has been monumental, the largest restoration effort for the trustees, anyways, one of the largest landscape efforts in the state's history. Wouldn't have happened without everybody here. So with that, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Alejandra, and hopefully I left enough time.
Thanks, Russ. So before moving off of the Great Marsh, I will be talking about other projects throughout the state, including all the way down to the islands. But before moving off of the Great Marsh, I wanted to highlight a few other small projects that we are currently planning on doing or are in progress within the larger project areas that we're doing the salt marsh restoration that Russ just mentioned. So these are tidal restriction removals. We have 3 that we've identified within the Great Marsh already, and 2 of which we're already working on site assessment and modeling to develop sort of initial design for the removal of these tidal restrictions. So there's various tidal restrictions within the Great Marsh, many of which correspond to old causeways, embankments, or other legacy infrastructure from agriculture or other roadways that are basically restricting flow, tidal flow on a daily basis to the upstream portions of the marsh. So what we're really trying to do is remove these tidal restrictions within a few years of doing the platform hydrology restoration that Russ talked about. This is really just to optimize the restoration potential of these areas and to make sure we're not increasing tidal flow to some of the upstream areas without addressing the altered hydrology within a reasonable time period. So I just wanted to highlight these 3 that we're currently working on. Moving to the southern part of the coast on Massachusetts, we have this large project going on both Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, which is funded by a National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant, and it's really focused on following a series of assessments that have identified 3 main priority sites that are vulnerable to sea level rise on our properties within Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. And on both of these projects, we're working with a coastal engineering firm called GZA Geoenvironmental to carry out site assessments, hydraulic modeling of the areas, and to develop preliminary restoration design for both of these properties. And though, as Russ mentioned, the Nantucket work is more focused on the barrier beach resilience, we are prioritizing marsh habitat and the restoration of marsh habitat and wetland migration as a tool for strengthening the resilience of these barriers to sea level rise. So it does go both ways. Both barrier beaches are protecting salt marshes and enabling those calmer estuaries in which salt marshes can thrive. And salt marshes can also act as a tool to reinforce those barriers to sea level rise. So as a whole, we're really focusing on prioritizing nature-based solutions within our projects on the islands, which really is a combination of techniques that create multi-layer defense systems working with natural processes rather than against them. So these techniques can include things like facilitating marsh migration, implementing things like oyster reefs or other naturalized reefs, and also just other systems that are capturing naturally moving sediment and enhancing existing vegetation. So that could be something like sand fencing to encourage sediment capturing on barrier islands, or oyster reefs within nearshore environments. On Nantucket, so this is within Cosquitaco 2, we're partnering with the Nantucket Conservation Foundation as we co-own the Cosquitaco 2 Wildlife Refuge. GZA has, which is our engineering firm, has identified 3 key sites that we're currently developing restoration alternatives for. We do currently have a very preliminary list of alternatives that we're exploring, all nature-based and focus on strengthening the overall resilience of the barrier beach and increasing its resilience to a breach that would allow exchange of water between the open ocean and the harbor. So with the next steps of these preliminary alternatives will be to model them in terms of hydraulic flow and sediment flow within the estuary to figure out how they would impact these dynamics on the refuge in the long term and also in face of sea level rise and large expected storm events. I do want to say that we have a public meeting for this project coming up on April 5th, where we'll be presenting sort of a short list of preliminary alternatives. So if you aren't interested in learning more about this project, please stay tuned to that and more communications about that. On Martha's Vineyard, we are working on doing a landscape scale approach to salt marsh restoration within Chappaquiddick, which is an island off of the main island. And we're really focusing on kind of expansive salt marsh restoration, similar to what we've been doing on the North Shore and the Great Marsh. The ownership of the salt marsh, as you can see in the map here on the left, is really fragmented, though the trustees does own a significant portion of it, as well as some other local landowner partners, as you can see listed here on the slide. It is still very fragmented with over 200 acres of salt marsh within our project area that we're targeting. So what we're doing is working with local partners and landowners to approach this landscape scale as we've been doing in the North Shore. And our design here is really focusing on both techniques that are going to strengthen the overall resilience of the barrier beach system, but also encourage salt marsh expansion. And we'll be doing a parallel design that focuses more on the trio techniques that Russ mentioned that we are currently doing in the Great Marsh. So it's that ditch remediation, runneling, and microtopography. So it's really parallel designs that will focus on strengthening the overall barrier beach system of Cape Pogue, but also encouraging salt marsh restoration and expansion, as well as potentially facilitating migration. Let's see. Okay, here we go. So moving further north in the state, moving to the South Shore, we have another project within World's End where we're hoping to pilot 2 really innovative restoration techniques that are hopefully going to be really low cost and be able to be small scale, but also scaled up. And so we're currently in the early stages of the site assessment for this marsh restoration project. And it's focused largely within dammed meadows, which is a 14-acre tidal flat within World's End. If you've ever been to the property, when you walk in through that main bridge, it's the tidal flat that you see on the right-hand side. And it's a beautiful tidal flat that currently looks somewhat like this at low tide and then at high tide, where it has a history of allowing tidal exchange back into the harbor back into the tidal inlet after being restricted for many years. And so due to all of this changes in tidal flow, there's been significant subsidence within the tidal flat, which you can see in this picture above here. And so as a result, we've had significant vegetation die off of the salt marsh that used to be within dammed meadows. So what these 2 techniques are trying to achieve is really encouraging the regrowth of the salt marsh grasses that are currently within the fringe of this 14-acre tidal flat by trialing out these 2 techniques that focus on really reducing wave energy impacts to the leading edge of the marsh to reduce existing erosion. There's really strong currents in this area. but also on capturing suspended sediment with each incoming tide that will eventually, over time, improve soil conditions and facilitate the expansion of those existing salt marsh grasses further into the tidal flat to restore a more expansive salt marsh in this area. I will also just say that these techniques, the goal is to really identify their feasibility within fringe marsh habitats, but also to identify a permitting pathway within these for Massachusetts as to really innovating techniques. One of the techniques is, I haven't really described the techniques. One of them is the use of these lobster-style traps that are placed kind of in front of the leading edge of the marsh to reduce that wave energy. So that's the technique that's focused on reducing wave energy. And then we have what we're trying to pilot is a configuration of salt marsh hay bales. So the same idea that we're using with ditch remediation, which is using salt marsh hay to capture sediment that comes in with the incoming tide, but in a slightly different configuration that will capture the sediment that comes into the tidal flat. And over time improve soil conditions. So the same concept that we're doing with ditch remediation, but in a different configuration here. And I will finish out by talking about a project that we are currently partnering with a local watershed association in the Neponset River estuary with Neponset River Watershed, or NEPRA. This is a partnership that has 2 phases so far, and the first phase was focused on carrying out a salt marsh health assessment of the estuary. This is a pretty expansive salt marsh within the Neponset estuary, but because it's in a heavily urbanized setting, it has been altered a lot over the years. And so it has some ditching as the same as the North Shore, but it also has a lot of various berms, areas of fill, a lot of infrastructure around it that is preventing migration, as well as a lot of other freshwater and nutrient-heavy inputs from the surrounding uplands. So what we're really focused on in this first phase is to do a little bit of an assessment of what the current conditions are of this marsh, what the threats are of the marsh, what the vegetation looks like currently, as well as really identify a history of impacts to this marsh. Where we're at now is at phase 2, which is moving into modeling and preliminary design within the estuary. And so what our goal is here for restoration design is a little bit similarly to what we're doing in Chappaquiddick. It's kind of looking at salt marsh restoration on the platform, but also looking at how we can increase the overall resilience of the estuary with different, potentially more nature-based techniques. And they're really focused on improving salt marsh habitat health, but also really focused on coastal community protection, since this is a really heavily developed area, and we're really looking at coastal flood protection benefits from the salt marsh, as well as how we can maintain the elevation of the salt marsh with sea level rise. So as we are moving forward, we're currently modeling various scenarios of what different salt marsh restoration techniques might do to the marsh, and how that will impact coastal community protection. And we're working with both Neponset River Watershed Association and with Woods Hole Group to carry out that preliminary design. And I think with that, I will leave it. And I know I didn't go too far into any of those projects, but we're always open to questions if people want to learn more about those final projects. So thank you.
Thank you, Alejandra and Russ. And actually, it's great that you mentioned that, Alejandra. One question we had that just came in was, can you expand just a little bit on the island project, specifically how far along are you in the salt marsh and barrier beach resilience?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're a little bit ahead on the Nantucket work in comparison to the work that we're doing on Chappaquiddick. So we're currently at a preliminary list of alternatives. We've carried out most of the modeling for the Nantucket work. So it's a sort of pretty comprehensive series of models that look at sediment flow as well as tidal flow and velocity within velocity of tidal exchange within the project area. Our next stage of this project is really to discuss the alternatives with key stakeholders and take a look at kind of what we're interested in pursuing further and finding out more about. And then these alternatives that are selected on a kind of a short list will be modeled in terms of, kind of fit into those hydraulic models and sediment flow models. And we'll be able to find out what those alternatives mean for sediment and accretion and other tidal flow within the refuge. So basically, how are these proposed restoration alternatives actually going to play out within the refuge, both now and in significant storm events, as well as in future sea level rise scenarios. And then on Chappaquiddick, we are kind of following a similar pathway where we are a little bit behind, but in terms of timeline, but we'll be coming up with also a short list of alternatives and are looking at both the potential for doing ditch remediation and runneling within the marsh platform, but also what other techniques would assist us in increasing the overall resilience of the barrier. So we're hoping to have preliminary design for both by the end of this summer, 2025, and then hopefully move forward to full design and permitting in the next phase for both.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Another question here is, Russ mentioned thin layer deposition. Are you using that approach to flooding marshes?
Got it. Yeah, interesting question. So thin layer deposition or sediment placement, for anybody on the call that may not know it, it's essentially just adding some form of sediment that onto the marsh surface to essentially expedite that process of elevating the marshes elevation. Currently, that's not a option in Massachusetts. The state, particularly DEP, has developed a set of a guidance document that in theory allows for that to happen. That's essentially hot off the press. Our initial restoration efforts have not included thin layer or sediment placement, mainly because we want to get the hydrology fixed before we start using that tool, should we need it. If you think about it, the rationale for that is it would be a Band-Aid approach. If we don't fix the hydrology, adding sediment, some layers, whether it's centimeters or inches on top without doing that, it'll just end up having sea level rise catch up to it. We want to turn back on the natural marsh building process. And then if it's not enough, right? If it doesn't work, then we can look to that as a secondary tool to help the marsh. So not as of yet, but it is one we would like to have in the toolbox.
Thank you again. Is there any planning for marsh migration upland on trustees' land or other ownership?
That's a good question. Cynthia, do you want to try to address that? Good.
I can also tackle it
Yeah,
too a little bit. I mean, I guess I'd say nothing that I'm aware of directly. We have identified a few parcels next to some of our existing reservations where, again, the modeling tells us these would be the initial areas that would receive greater flooding from salt marsh, from sea level rise. So they make sense for us to start the land conservation process. That can take a very long time if the owner isn't necessarily willing to sell or et cetera. So nothing in the short term that's looking at modifying current conditions on trustees' properties. This is going to be a very slow process, but it's one we're very interested in understanding where those corridors exist, not so much creating them, but where are they going to occur. Unlike areas further south, I'm talking the Carolinas, Georgia, where the coastal plain is vast and it rises just a foot or two over miles and miles as it goes inland. Massachusetts is not like that. We have a glacial geology here. So in many cases, our salt marsh is just going to creep up by inches. So we'll see that fringe marsh make very small gains, but it's going to be less than what we lose if we don't intervene. Then there are some areas where they may be brackish marsh or fresh marsh further inland along these tidal creeks that would most likely be the areas where we're going to see salt marsh get created. Those would be land conservation targets, for example. Don't know if there's anything you want to add, Cynthia. No, okay.
Excellent. Do the deposit slides show what the region will look like with or without remediation? And it's a two-part question. Do the remediation options call for the relocation of urban structures?
Yeah, I can try to answer that. So these slides do not show what the region would look like with or without remediation, but one of our modeling scenarios is a no action scenario. So in the event that the marsh would stay the same elevation and we would have predicted sea level rise, then we are doing that model. We don't have those model results yet, but we're happy to, sort of share them later on once we do have them. And we are certainly looking at relocation for urban structures. It's a complicated scenario within this estuary because, as I mentioned, it's really heavily developed. It's very fragmented ownership, and there's no one obvious area to where as to where the marsh could migrate or where we could kind of allow for a flood pathway. It also has, like Russ mentioned, it's very the topography immediately upland is really, really different from the marsh elevation. So you have really, really high elevations immediately upstream or sort of landwise of the marsh. So it's not incredibly easy, but we are kind of we do have a sort of a set of criteria at which we're evaluating potential flood pathways, and we're carrying out a series of public meetings to identify key community assets and kind of trying to gauge community response and municipal response to the potential for allowing a potential marsh migration area within this estuary. So we are looking at that. We just don't have the results yet.
Critical in this piece is that we're a nonprofit. Neponset River Watershed Association is a nonprofit. We're gathering all the information we think will be useful to the communities and the municipalities. Then we're going to work with the community, Boston, Quincy, and Milton, and say, now let's talk about this information and what we can do with it.
Yes, exactly.
Excellent, thank you. This question came in during your presentation, Russ. Is the marsh behind Good Harbor Beach in Gloucester not considered part of the Great Marsh? If not, is anything being done for the health of this marsh?
So technically, it is not part of the Great Marsh. It is separated by lots of, I think it's called Cape Ann granite. But yeah, it's not technically, and it's not on the trustees' radar because we don't own anything over there. Our focus is on the Great Marsh. But I must say, I don't know if there's any local efforts looking at that. There has been, I believe, a friends group more recently in the last couple of years that's taking more interest in the beach part of it and shorebird management that may also be looking at the salt marsh, but I must admit it's kind of on the periphery for me.
Excellent. How are we capturing lessons learned from early phases? And two-part, how have we changed plans for future phases based on these?
Good question. Russ, do you want me to try to approach that for phase 3?
Sure, absolutely. Go for it.
Yeah, so I think for phase 3, I mean, Russ talked a little bit more in detail about phase 1 and phase 2. And for phase 3, we're really scaling up. So in scaling up to over 1,000 acres, we encounter a lot of different challenges just in the sheer scale of it, but also in trying to adapt the techniques that we're currently using. So one of the key examples that we're doing a little bit differently in phase 3 is we have a slight adaptation of the runneling technique where we are both trying to intervene a little earlier in the decline trajectory of the marsh. So the marsh is going through a sort of subsidence trajectory that as we, as ditches get clogged, we have water logging areas within the marsh. eventually those waterlogged areas would breach on their own and we would establish that single channel hydrology again. But that can take 10, 20 years. And so what we're trying to do is intercept that trajectory and intercept that period of waterlogging where we lose a lot of vegetation. And we're trying to create those channels through pooled areas earlier on. So that's what we're doing with runnels now. And so we're technically calling those priority 2 runnels, and we're doing that as a pilot within phase 3. So with the state, through our permitting process, we identified that as something that we want to pilot within a 200-acre subset of phase 3. So we will be piloting that for the first 3 years, which comes along with a really intensive monitoring program within that pilot area, as well as in the larger pilot area. So those 3 years will be really focused on determining whether that early intervention and that slight adaptation of the technique is, is doing what we think it's going to do, if it's really interjecting that mega pool period, but also, how the vegetation is responding, how the hydrology is responding, and how quickly. So once we go through that pilot, we'll revisit that with regulatory agencies and see if we move forward and implement that modification of the technique to the full 1,000 acres. So that pilot will be within actually Greenwood Farm and I believe Hamlin Reservation. So those are going to be the tracks that do that. And then I think one of the other lessons learned is with scaling up comes the challenge of monitoring. A lot of the monitoring that we need for this project is for phase 1, it's been really intensive on the ground, partnering with University of New Hampshire, but also that was a little over 80 acres. So it's a little bit more manageable to do that intensive monitoring in 80 acres versus moving up to over 1,000. So I think one of the challenges that we're learning is we really need to focus on building our monitoring capacity, but also developing techniques that allow us to monitor at the landscape scale. Yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple things. So phase 1 was that 85 acres, and we didn't do runneling there. And then by the time we followed 2 years later with the design for phase 2, we really did add runnels. And some of the modifications that Alejandra's talking about for phase 3 is really there to expedite that restoration process through runnels. And we learned from phase 1 and 2 that this would be a beneficial tweak, because we now believe we have to go back to phase 1 and put in a few runnels. Now that we're nearing the completion of that kind of a 5-year project, we're seeing where they could really be beneficial. So we are learning along the way. Another thing was the nesting islands, or that micro topography. If we didn't stake them down really soon, we had a couple that actually floated away. It was pretty miraculous that they stayed intact. And I think one went about 500 feet, but it stayed intact. So we've tweaked, that process. So we know right away you got to stake those things down. So there's been some, lessons learned, but the big one is how fast, nature is going to respond to these tweaks to correct for the hydrology. So that primary 2 or priority 2, I always get that mixed up with the runnels for phase 3, is really designed to, expedite the time it's going to take for the marsh to go through this change. And by us adding in these runnels, we're also we're going to, especially for the long ditches, we're able to treat the whole ditch much faster and not slope it. So we're getting into some of the details that, kind of what happens out there with this, with the restoration techniques. But if we try to fill those ditches with hay too fast, you end up creating a blockage because there's only one way in and out. And by putting in these runnels in this location halfway down these ditches, we're able to have that water come and go to provide that outlet, but also a secondary source for delivering sediment into the core of the marsh. So all this is intended to expedite things so that the marsh can then essentially heal itself and get on track much faster than what we're seeing in phase one, which it's working and it's working exactly how we designed it, but we're now realizing, oh, we can perhaps accelerate this. In fact, we're very confident we can accelerate this process and with no additional risk at all. To give this marsh more time to settle in and adjust naturally and accrete so that it's ready for that steeper curve that we saw.
Excellent, thank you. And we have time for just one final question. If there's any additional questions or if we were unable to answer any questions, please feel free to reach out to events@thetrustees.org and we will be happy to field them. And the final question today is, have you documented any change in the marsh swallow population corresponding to the restoration efforts?
I can take that, and I think it was sparrow, not swallow, but I'm making that assumption. So not yet. We do monitor for the breeding birds with a target for the salt marsh sparrow, but as you can imagine, that's a very slow process, much like the vegetation. These guys really are have a lot of fidelity to the exact location in the marsh. So our strategy has been, if they will use these nesting islands, it will be the young from some of those that are successfully reproducing. So we are going to be looking much closer going forward to all of these nesting islands. We have, I think, 44 of these nesting islands. Phase 3 will add many more. And this year, we're going to be taking a look, like I said, much closer at if so far we have not seen any sparrow nesting on these islands. We are seeing them utilize them, foraging, resting, etc., but no actual breeding as of yet. The rest of the marsh, we still have them. So the restoration, even at Old Town Hill 5 years later, has certainly increased the suitability of that site for nesting sparrows, but we're not seeing that needle move really with the population, not yet anyways. But we're going to continue that monitoring. Good news is we still have them where we've completed that restoration.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Cynthia, if you could close the webinar today, thank you.
Everyone for joining us today. Hope you found it informative. You probably have lots of questions. So again, email Javon events@thetrustees.org. Let me know if I got that wrong, Javon. Next week, we have a webinar on forest resilience to climate change. So we hope we'll see you then. Wanted to give a final shout out to all of our donors, including our supporters, like top supporters, like our Founders Circle members. Your contributions really help make all of this work possible. And thank you again for investing in our mission and believing in a brighter future. See you next week.